Just a very quick introduction. On behalf of the Dublin Port Company and the East Wall History Group, I'd just like to say we are proud to present this online lecture series, which will mark the centenary of the attack on the London and North Western Rail Hotel on North Wall, which took place on the 11th of April in 1921. 100 years ago, the War of Independence was continuing. There would be a truce signed in a couple of months, but 100 years ago, even those closely involved with events didn't know that was coming and didn't realise they were into an endgame as such. The country was in turmoil. Dublin was at the centre of major military activity, and of course this had an impact on Dublin Port and on the communities in the surrounding area of Dublin Port. So in this series of 5 talks, we're going to look at events from 100 years ago. We're going to look at events in Dublin with a particular eye on Dublin Port and the surrounding communities. Last week, we looked at the issue of smuggling from international ports in and out of Dublin of weapons, men, etc. We're going to be looking at the deployment of Crown forces in Dublin and their activities. We're going to look at the activity of the revolutionary forces in the North Docklands area close to Dublin Port, and we'll also be looking at IRA casualties in Dublin during the War of Independence. But all the talks will continue up to May the 25th, or May the 20th, I think it is, sorry. And we just say, make sure you book your place in the talks for the future. So for tonight's talk, I'm delighted to welcome Liz Gillis, who's going to tackle the topic of assassination, intelligence and ambush, the IRA in the South Docks, 1919 to 1921. I had to write down my notes, what to say about Liz, because there's so much to say that I would have forgotten. Liz is a historian, a researcher, an author, and she's one of the leading organisers of the annual Burning of the Custom House commemoration. I think, along with our partner, Michael O'Doolan, they've done this for 12 years, and unfortunately, being the centenary year, COVID has changed our plans, but they're hosting a wonderful series of online talks themselves, and we'll have a commemoration on the 25th of May. She's the author of Women of the Irish Revolution, The Fall of Dublin, Revolution in Dublin, The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution, all by Mercier Press, and absolutely essential reading is May the 25th, The Burning of the Custom House, published by Kilmaine and Hills. But just before I hand over to Liz, just to let people know, there will be a questions and answer session after Liz's presentation. If you have any questions or you have any comments to make sure you throw them into the chat box. And afterwards, we'll have a good Q&A and a good discussion. And without further ado, looking forward to this myself. Here's Liz Gillis.
Thanks a million, Joe, for that fantastic introduction. And I'm just going to share my screen and get started. And I would just like to say a huge thank you to Dublin Port and the East Wall History Group for asking me to be part of the talks, in this series of talks. So I am just going to get stuck in. So the Sword Battalion. So as the title suggests, it's assassination, it's intelligence, it's ambush in the South Docks area, which was the Tour Battalion area of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA. Now, the Tour Battalion, it tends not to get really a look in after 1916, but all of the battalions in the Brigade of the IRA, they all held their own, but the narrative of certainly the War of Independence tends to be dominated by the activities of the 2nd Battalion and the Active Service Unit from 1920 on, and of course the squad. But all of the battalions had a role to play in the struggle for independence, especially War of Independence. But this talk just focuses on the Sword Battalion. But you can't look at the War of Independence without going back to the very beginning, so we're going to do that. And I mean go right back because the Sword Battalion area was involved from even before the volunteers were set up, and it's as far back as the Fianna, which was set up in 1909, co-founded by Countess Markievicz and Bulmer Hobson. Now, Na Fianna, it was the equivalent of the Baden-Powell Boy Scouts. They're very successful, and Countess Markovich really didn't like the fact that, you know, young Irish boys were joining the Boy Scouts to basically be recruits for the British Army. So she decided, and Bulmer Hobson decided, that there should be an Irish Boy Scout movement. So they co-founded Na Fianna Éireann. And some of the first recruits actually came from the Pearse Street area. There was a schoolmaster that was that was a teacher at the St Andrew's National School on Pearse Street, and Countess had a meeting with him to suss out if there would be any young members, young boys, that might be interested in joining this new Republican Boy Scout movement. So he put the word out, and there was a response. And some of the earliest members were the Fitzgerald brothers, including Leo Fitzgerald, and he ties in with events in March 1921. So you can literally say that the first members of Na Fianna came from Pearse Street. They went to St Andrew's National School, and of course then Na Fianna has its headquarters in Camden Street, which was slap bang in the middle of the Tour Battalion area, and number 34 Camden Street. Unfortunately, the building no longer exists, but at that hall you not only had Na Fianna, but you had the Irish Volunteers, later the IRA, Cumann na Món, Inine na hÉireann, the Irish Citizen Army, all of these revolutionary groups. All of these groups that would be involved in the events between 1913 and 1923. It was like a melting pot, just one of the many places that these groups met. But there you have it from right from the beginning, an interest from locals in that area and wanting to get involved in the future struggle. And then moving on to 1913, so we had the formation of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army roughly around the same time, November 1913. And of course, the Ulster Volunteer Force had been set up earlier that year in response to the placing of Home Rule on the statute books. They would do anything to make sure Home Rule would not be introduced to Ireland. There was no one to protect Home Rules, hence the Irish Volunteers were set up. And the Irish Citizen Army were a citizens' army. Difference between the citizen army and the volunteers was that you had women in the Irish citizen army. Now, the women were involved at this moment. They had their organisation in Inine na hÉireann, but based primarily in Dublin. They go national in 1914 when they set up Cumann na Món. So they would be then the groups, the dominant groups to take part in the Easter Rising. But the Irish Volunteers, when it was set up, you had Dublin Brigade, Cork Brigade, Galway Brigade. Pretty much every county had a brigade. And the brigades are broken up into battalions, which are made up of companies and sections and so on. So in Dublin, there were 5 battalions. So the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th were in the city, and the 5th was the Fingal battalion. And the way Dublin was divided up, you had the 1st and 2nd operating on the north side of the city, so the 2nd battalion were around the north wall and so on, and then the 3rd and 4th battalions were on the south side of the city, and the 3rd battalion was Ringsend, Camden Street and that area. The dividing line would be Camden Street, Patrick Street. 4th Battalion went from Camden Street all the way out to Clondalkin. As I said, 5th Battalion was Fingal, and they were the battalions that you had in 1916. But just to explain, just to show you on the map, the actual area that the 3rd Battalion operated in, it was quite big. Like, you know, it was the southeast of the city, but in 1916 there were 6 companies. So you had A, B, C, D, E and F was out in Dunleary, and then you had about 400 or so members. Now that number of companies, it did increase between 1919 and 1921. In fact, the Dublin Brigade split into two. You had the Dublin number 2 Brigade, because it took in all of those companies and battalions that had been set up that were operating out by Dunleary and so on. But just looking at this map, and you can see the area circled. So these are just some of the Crown forces that were operating in the Tour Battalion area. Now, just some of them, because there, as we know, there was a ring of steel around Dublin. The amount of barracks, big and small barracks, and police barracks that were around Dublin City, they were dealing with a huge force of the enemy. But the substantial barracks and important barracks in the Tour Battalion area. So right up the road from in what was Great Brunswick Street, you had what's now Pearse Street Police Station, Great Brunswick Street DMP station at that time. Then you had Dublin Castle, and there were military and police in there. And also just right around the corner you had Beggar's Bush barracks. But then there were smaller barracks isolated in dotted in and around that, and also Portobello, was now Cattle Brewer Barracks, would be within the Tour Battalion area as well. And just to show you the areas that each company sort of operated in, and we have on the left the list of streets and places. But then just to show you, it's an interesting map. It's actually taken from one of the pension files, the organisation roles in the military pension file series, and this is a very crude map of the Tour Battalion area, but you can see there it's the whole area of operation for the Tour Battalion. So A Company, they were based around Redmond's Hill, Ainger Street to Georgia Street, Dane Street, Parliament Street, Camden Street, Wexford Street. That area became known as the Dardanelles because they were so active in the War of Independence. B Company, they operated from Dawson Street, Delia Street, back to the end of Pearse Street. That would include Baggot Street, the Canal, and the Liffey to O'Connell Bridge. You then had C Company, and they were based around South Richmond Street, Harcourt Road, Harcourt Street, Grafton Street, College Green, Westmoreland Street. D Company operated in Ringsend, Sandymount to Merrion Road. E Company, they were based in Leeson Street to Booterstown Avenue, with Renlet and Rathmines to Mount Pleasant Avenue in their vicinity, and F Company were Dunleary. So there is the whole of the battalion area covered in those 6 companies. But the ones that we're sort of going to look at are the ones in the immediate area of the South Dock. So what would be B and D companies. And here you see the map. This is B Company's area of operation. So I've seen it there in the previous slide. But the main sort of line of action, or the main thoroughfare through B Company's area, was Great Brunswick Street, Pearse Street. And throughout the War of Independence, there were regular ambushes and attacks, because it was one of the main roads for the military coming from Ringsend to get up to O'Connell Street and so on. D Company, there we have it. So they would then immediately, where B Company ended, D Company began. So the end of Pearse Street, you're into Ringsend, and then all the way out to Sandymount, and that was D Company's area of operation. Now, the headquarters of B Company, and you all probably know this building, you've gone to the library, the Gilbert Library, on Pearse Street. It's now Pearse Street Library. But number 144 is now part of the library, but that was St Andrew's Hall. St Andrew's Catholic Hall, and that was the headquarters of B Company, of the 3rd Battalion. It was later the headquarters of the 3rd Battalion itself, and you've probably looked at the plaque time and time again, and that just mentions some of the volunteers that were associated with B Company, and literally a who's who of the 3rd Battalion would have passed through that door at some stage throughout 1916 to 1923. And we know that there's big names in the volunteers and later the IRA, and there were some big names in the 3rd Battalion in the early days. So just to sort of highlight a few of them, So of course Eamon de Valera, probably the biggest, and he was captain of E Company, and he became the commandant of the Tour Battalion in 1915. But then we have the O'Rahilly, and we all know, or we've heard of the O'Rahilly's charge in 1916, where he was killed leading out a patrol of volunteers as they were trying to make their way to break through Moore Street. But he was a captain of B Company Sword Battalion. Joseph O'Connor, he was commandant of A Company of the Tour Battalion, and he was later promoted or appointed as commandant of the entire battalion. So after 1916's reorganisation, Joseph O'Connor becomes the commanding officer of the entire battalion. And Sean McMahon, and McMahon Bridge is Sean McMahon Bridge is named after him, and he was captain at B Company, but he became OC at B Company after 1916. But then he's moved to GHQ staff. So these were big players in the whole revolutionary period. And when we come to 1916, you know, the biggest success that the volunteers had in 1916 was in the Tour Battalion area. So Eamon de Valera was tasked with occupying Bolands and secured the railways, because they knew that reinforcements would arrive from Britain. Like all of the volunteers, the volunteer ranks, the Tour Battalion's ranks were depleted thanks to the countermand and order given by another member of B Company, Owen McNeill, who was the officer in charge of the volunteers, or who thought he was in charge of them. But the biggest success of the Easter Rising happened within the confines of the Tour Battalion area, and that was at Mount Street Bridge, where 17 volunteers under the command of Michael Malone and George Reynolds, they were positioned in number 25 Northumberland Road on one side of the bridge, and then Clanwilliam House on the far side of the bridge, and they inflicted casualties of 234 killed and wounded of the Sherwood Foresters, who had made their way, arrived in Ireland from Liverpool, and were coming from Dunleary and marched right down Northumberland Road right into a trap. And they were the last to surrender as well in 1916. Now Eamon de Valera, because he was a commandant, he was sentenced to death. He wasn't executed, but not because he was an American citizen. Tom Clark was an American citizen, and he was executed. When the members of the Tour Battalion surrendered, they were brought to Balls Bridge to the RDS, and by the time they were brought to Richmond Barracks, the court-martials had begun, the executions had begun, and public opinion had begun to change. So they were got there basically too late. So nothing to do with the fact that he was American. However, we'll move on. Now, after 1916, so the volunteer leadership, it was gone. The leaders were executed, and although 1916 they were defeated, it was not the war being over. It didn't mean that. 1916 was only part of this story, and the volunteers coming on, they all reorganized, and the difference between 1916 and what was to come was that public opinion had changed in favour of the Republicans. They became known as the Irish Republican Army in 1919. As I said, Joseph O'Connor was elected the commandant of the Tour Battalion. You have numbers increasing in the companies across the country, and basically they knew that a fight was going to come. And what do you need to fight? You need weapons. So basically 1917, 1918, it was all about rearming, getting retrained and so on, and that's what they do. Also, you have the political developments taking centre stage. So you have the rise of Sinn Féin, which was the Moderate Nationalist Party, labelled a hardline Republican party by the authorities and the media. Completely wrong. It was a ready-made party for the Republicans, and they began to win the local elections in 1917. They succeed completely with the 1918 general election, when they literally wiped the board clean. They are become the political party in Ireland. The Irish Parliamentary Party was gone. They won, what, 75 out of 160 or something like that. And that was helped, or the rise of Sinn Féin It was helped by the conscription crisis, where the British government tried to introduce conscription to Ireland. It was hugely resisted by everyone, and we can see that by the end of 1918, Sinn Féin was on the crest of a wave. Because they had won the general election, they decided they would set up their own parliament, Dáil Éireann. It met for the first time on the 24th of January 1919. And that was also the same day, by pure coincidence, that you had the events down in Solohead, Beg and Tipperary, where members of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, they ambushed 2 RIC men escorting a consignment of gelignite. The RIC men were killed, and this is officially seen as the beginning of the War of Independence, even though you had engagements prior to this date. So the War of Independence begins in January 1919, but it didn't actually, the events that happened on the 24th of January 1919, that didn't follow through for the whole year. You've got that attack down Tipperary, but then it dies down and so on. So it sort of goes in waves. But what really dominates 1919 is the assassinations that take place. So Michael Collins, who he really rose to prominence after 1916 very, very quickly, thanks to Kathleen Clark. And he was the Minister of Finance in Dáil Éireann, but also he was appointed Director of Intelligence. Now, the one thing that the authorities were brilliant at was intelligence. You had the G-men, the political police in the DMP, and at this stage, after 1916, they were based in Brunswick Street, in Pearse Street Station. But you had friendly G-men, as in men who were friendly to the Republicans. And they went to Collins and they told him that if you're going to take them on again, you're going to have to beat them at their own game, and you're going to have to play the intelligence war, and this is how you're going to do it. So from the inside, Collins was getting this information, and the type of information that he was getting is, you can see it there, the photograph on the top, my top right. This is a photograph of G-men, of policemen, political police, and you can see there's numbers over all of them, and all they have, or beside the numbers, are all their names. And quite sinister, you see number 7, there's no name, just beside it is dead. So he was gone. Don't know who he was, but he was gotten by the IRA. But what Collins did, and what his men did, was they sent out warnings to the G-men, because these were the ones that were really the eyes and ears in Dublin of the British government. You have the RIC doing that around the country, but these guys knew who the leaders, the big names in the Republican movement were. They were the ones that had identified the leaders after 1916, so they were a real threat. They were sent warnings to desist their activities, to give up, and if they did, they'd be left well alone. If they didn't, then they would pay a very high price, and some did listen, but others didn't. Now, what was Collins going to do with that information, or with those men who didn't agree to give up their activities? And who was he going to get to carry out these duties? They were going to be assassinated, and who he needed were young men, young volunteers, who were called the Squad. They were also known as the 12 Apostles, because they were originally, there was only 12 of them, and you can see just some of the members of the Squad in the bottom picture on my left. Now, you have Collins setting up his intelligence unit, so it was basically like the equivalent of the DMP, and that included men like Charlie Dalton and Frank Thornton, Liam Tobin. They were his right-hand men, Tom Cullen. They would be like his key men. And these guys just every day were trailing through newspapers, looking for photographs, getting in information that was coming from everywhere. And it was coming from everywhere. And then they were passing on the information to the Squad. Because once they were identified as in potential targets, it would fall to the Squad to then assassinate those DMP men. And an intelligence officer had to accompany the Squad unit that was going to carry out the assassinations, and that's exactly what happened. And the first assassinations take place in late July 1919. But I just want to focus your attention on this one, which happened on the 12th of September 1919. The dog Smith was the first one to be assassinated. He was actually shot as he was literally going in through his front door of his home out in Drumcondra. And it was very soon followed by the shooting of Detective Constable Daniel Hoey. Now, this was even more brazen than the shooting of Smith, because Hoey was shot as he went to work. He was literally going into the police station at Pearse Street, and he was shot by the IRA. Now, again, he was really targeted because he was really aggressive in his activities. He'd only been involved the night before in a raid on Harcourt Street, so he knew who was sort of involved in the IRA. And you actually have it there that in the newspaper report, it is known that deceased was engaged yesterday in company with other officers on duty in Harcourt Street in the districts of the city. So that's the reason he was targeted by the IRA. But it happened in broad daylight. And if you go by the police station, it's the back Townsend Street side, that doorway is still there, where you can see it there clearly in the photograph. That's where he was shot. And that's the way the first year really of the War of Independence is carried out. You have these assassinations of the DNP men and RIC men around the country, but very quickly Michael Collins really they completely undermined the British intelligence service. This had never happened before, and the authorities were caught completely off guard. Now, in 1920, early 1920, sorry, things took a turn for the worst with the arrival of these two groups in Ireland. So the first to arrive was the Black and Tans. Because the IRA had been so successful against the RIC, as in either assassinating them or forcing them to resign, it was very hard to get recruits for the RIC, so they had to raise a force, and it was predominantly made up of Englishmen, but there were some Irishmen in the Black and Tans, and they were all ex-servicemen, and they arrived around 25th of March 1920. Now, they were a permanent police force. So they were going to be here for as long as the British government were here. They were actual members of the RIC, given the name the Black and Tans because they hadn't got enough uniforms, and the Irish, quick-witted, gave them the nickname the Black and Tans. And then in July 1920, you have the arrival of the Auxiliaries. Now, they were a temporary force, so they were only going to be in existence for the duration of this conflict. And again, they were ex-servicemen, but the difference between the two units was the Auxiliaries was made up of ex-British officers. So you have DSO, medal winners, and so on. These were highly trained men. All of them had seen service or experienced firsthand battle during the First World War. They were battle-hardened men. And I will say, it has been said they were taken from the prisons. They were criminals. They weren't. They had got possibly excellent war records. They arrived in Ireland, and what they did here definitely was criminal, but they weren't taken from the prisons. They were a law unto themselves. But just to show you, in the Sword Battalion area, who you had up against the IRA in terms of the Auxiliaries, you had the Depot Company in Beggars Bush. So Beggars Bush was the headquarters of the Auxies. You then had F, Z and S Company. They were based in Dublin Castle, and F Company were notorious. And then in March 1921, you have the arrival of Q Company. So they have 5 companies of auxiliaries based in the Tour Battalion area. And I think there was like 13 companies in all. I could be wrong, but the numbers were far lower compared to that of the Black and Tans. But these two groups, they left a trail of devastation behind them wherever they went. And with their arrival, you have the reorganisation of the British Intelligence Service, and those two things coupled together, the British then began to have successes against the IRA, and they began to hit back. And certainly by the autumn of 1920, the IRA were suffering some big losses. And just a couple of examples. You had the shooting of Sean Tracy in Talbot Street. So he who had kicked off the War of Independence in Tipperary. And he was very active up in Dublin with Dan Breen, Sean Hogan, Seamus Robinson with the squad. You then had Terence McSweeney died after a 75 day hunger strike. The 4th of November, you had the execution of Kevin Barry in Mountjoy Jail. Now, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, was so confident of the successes that he was hearing that the British were having against the IRA that on the 9th of November, he made a speech at the Lord Mayor's Bank was saying, basically, by the activities that they are sort of carrying out in Ireland, they have murder by the throat. Now, 3 of Collins's key intelligence men, they were actually picked up by the authorities. Now, they were let go because they didn't realise who they had, but Collins knew they were going to strike. They were getting too close. Someone had to strike first. Something big was going to happen. He decided that it would be him that would strike first. And then we have the events known as Bloody Sunday. So, this was an operation planned by Collins, sanctioned by the Dáil, sanctioned by Cattlebrew, Minister for Defence, to assassinate British secret agents. The difference between 1919, the intelligence officers 1919 and 1920 was the intelligence, the G-men, they worked in the police stations. People knew openly who they were, but they didn't know who these new intelligence officers were because they arrived from England. They were specially picked. They didn't openly advertise that they were intelligence. They were businessmen. That was their cover. And they lived in lodging houses all around the city, but primarily on the south side, mainly in the Tour Battalion area. So the events on Bloody Sunday morning really are focused on in and around the Tour Battalion area. And there were originally 50 targets on the list. Cattlebrew took off at least 15 because there wasn't enough evidence against them. And you can see here on the map pretty much all of the addresses that were targeted that morning, 21st November, and they are all in the Tour Battalion area, the majority of them with the exception of the Gresham Hotel. So you can see there from the newspaper headline, it was just a day of just complete destruction. But if you can imagine, at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, just the sound of the church bells just chiming, it's crisp November morning, and you just imagine these units of men. And there were members of Cumann on there as well. They were waiting to take the guns off the IRA his squads. And they go to the addresses that they've been told to go to. The knocks comes to the doors. They barge in to the lodging houses. You hear roars, you hear shouts, and then you hear gunshots and you hear screams. And within minutes, it was over. But close to 160 men and women took part in this operation. 15 people died. There were 14 killed immediately, and 1 was fatally wounded. But just to show you the areas, some of the addresses that were targeted that morning in the Tour Battalion area, and it was members of the Tour Battalion that took part. So you have the squad. It's seen as a squad operation. But although, remember, the squad is only a small group of people, they could not go to 35 addresses, so you needed that mass support, and a lot of that support came from members of the Tour Battalion. So 119 Lower Bagger Street, members of B Company were sent there, and at that address, Captain Begali was killed. 92 Lower Bagger Street, again, members of B Company Tour Battalion took part in that operation. And what I mean by it is that you would have volunteers, IRA men going into the building, identifying or giving the support within the building, and also providing the protective cover outside the building. And at 92 Lower Bagger Street, Captain Newbury was killed. Now, Pembroke Street, this was the worst address. This was believed to be a British intelligence HQ, and it's a double-sided house. You can see it there. And as I said, it was believed to be the headquarters, so you had a large number of intelligence officers there, as well as ordinary, like sort of British soldiers. But the party that was sent there included Paddy Flanagan. He was Tour Battalion. Charlie Dalton, Collins' intelligence officer, because they had to identify those men, but also they were there to gather up any of the paperwork that might be that the officers may have on the IRA. And the descriptions of this scene, it was like an abattoir, because at this location you had a number of men killed and wounded. So basically Captain Price, Major Dowling and Colonel Montgomery were killed. Colonel Montgomery was fatally wounded, and wounded was Colonel Woodcock, Lieutenant Murray and Captain Keenley side. I would say there's a great book, An Officer's Wife in Ireland, and it was written by Colonel Woodcock's wife, and it's just a great first-hand account of what happened in the house on that morning from the British perspective, from a civilian witness. And then we have 16 Northumberland Road, and it was D Company. C Company were involved at Pembroke Street, and D Company were involved at number 16 Northumberland Road. You had the shootings at Mount Street, 22 Lower Mount Street or Upper Mount Street, and you had a warning. A woman shouted what was going on, and there were auxiliary cadets nearby, and they were trying to make their way back to Beggars Bush Barracks, which wasn't too far away, and they were caught by the IRA, and it was ADRIC cadets Frank Garnes and Cecil Augustus Morris that were killed at 16 Northumberland Road. And of course, we know the devastation didn't end there, because we have the events at Crow Park where the auxiliaries and the RAC retaliated and basically opened fire on civilians. And then it ended in the early hours of the following morning with the murders of Dick McKee, Paddock Clancy and Conor Clune in Dublin Castle. But one of the darkest days in the War of Independence, but dominated in the 3rd Battalion. It dominates everything about that day. Now, the auxiliaries, they were a fearsome group. As I said, these are battle-hardened men, and they had an attitude about them, but they had an air of superiority about them as well. That was knocked out at Kilmichael, which followed a week later, a week after the events on Bloody Sunday. But they hadn't been really attacked as a unit in Dublin yet. But who carried out the first attack on the Auxies in Dublin? It was A Company of the 3rd Battalion. And an aspect of the war, which was a really important aspect, was intelligence and how we gathered intelligence. A lot of intelligence went through the postal service. A lot of informers stupidly sent letters through the mail. So the IRA would regularly intercept the mail. They had people working in the post offices anyway for them, but it was decided that A Company, 3rd Battalion, would attack the auxiliaries, and they did that on the 14th of December 1920, and they attacked them at Balls Bridge post office. The post office is still there, and you can see there from the headlines, very dramatic: bombs and bullets, a brisk engagement, no casualties reported. And this was a huge coup for the IRA, because they were bringing the fight to the auxiliaries. Now, after Bloody Sunday, so Collins's intelligence offices, where he was based, it was right under the nose of Dublin Castle. But after Bloody Sunday, things really began to heat up, so they had to move premises. So IRA GHQ intelligence, it moved from Crow Street to Pearse Street, to an office above the Palace, what was the Palace Cinema in Pearse Street. So there you have GHQ intelligence being based in this area, and they continued the intelligence war from that space. But again, after Bloody Sunday, you had so many volunteers being arrested. So they set up Ballykinler Camp after Bloody Sunday. It was just mass internment, and just fellas were being picked up left, right and centre. But again, it looked like the British were gaining the upper hand, and it was decided that the IRA should develop full-time units in Dublin. Now, you had the flying columns around the country, the mobile units made up mainly of men that were on the run. But you didn't have that in Dublin. And we have to remember that the volunteers were a volunteer army. You can see why ambushes took place, at certain times of the day, is because the guys were working. Unless you're on the run, if you could still work, you work. Then you carried out your ambush or your patrols at night when you're finished work. But it was decided in December 1920 that there should be a dedicated full-time unit to take the fight to the enemy. So the active service unit was set up. And Paddy Flanagan, who was OC of C Company, who was involved at Pembroke Street on Bloody Sunday, he was appointed OC of the active service unit. So a 3rd Battalion man was appointed the commanding officer, and it had 4 sections, and each section was taken from one of the battalions. So you had number 1, 2, 3 and 4 sections, about 12, 13 men. There were 50 men in all. And their primary goal was to attack the Crown forces at every opportunity. And they did that. Number 1 and 2 section operated on the north side of the city, so in the battalion area. And again, number 3 and 4 operated on the south side. But if there was a big operation, then they would amalgamate. For example, the custom house would be just one example I would give you. They were under the direct control of IRA GHQ, and this is where it gets funny, because GHQ, a bit like what they were trying to do with the IRA around the country, and that the IRA in, say, Cork, if they wanted to carry out an ambush, they would have to, send up, permission to carry out this ambush. It could be intercepted, the mail, and also the opportunity might, be missed. So you don't have them. You have them send in reports after the events take place. But they tried to have that control over the active service unit, and it didn't last very long, because number 1 section was nearly completely wiped out, because they were waiting around in one position for so long that they were obvious targets, and they literally escaped by the skin of their teeth. After that, the ASU decided, no, we will pick when we strike, because it could literally be at a moment's notice, because they were ready to go at a moment's notice, and then they would forward the information to GHQ and basically sanction the operation after it happened. And there you can see just some of the members of number 3 section, and you've got a mix of A company, C company, G company, and B company. So they were taken from all different companies as well, out of the 3rd Battalion. And there we've got just some members of the active service unit, the 3rd Battalion members, including George White, Michael White and James Doyle, just to name a few. Now, this is a really interesting list, because this shows you the activities, the number of attacks that were carried out by the 3rd Battalion between January and July 1921. There are 45 attacks listed there. So what that shows is that the 3rd Battalion were very, very, very active in their area. And look where they were happening. You've got attacks at Nassau Street, the corner of Bishop Street, Merrion Square, College Green, Pearse Street, Ainger Street, Grand Canal Bridge, Camden Street, Harcourt Street, again, Pearse Street, Wexford Street, Clare Street, Custom House, Stevens Green, Pearse Street, Ringsend. The list goes on. So they were extremely active in their areas. And then another big engagement that is the 3rd Battalion is involved in, and has a direct connection with Pearse Street and the Ringsend area, of course, is the 14th of March and the Battle of Great Brunswick Street. And the reason that happened was because on the 14th of March, the people of Ireland basically woke up to read of the executions of these 6 IRA men, who had been arrested earlier on, some for their involvement in Bloody Sunday, or alleged involvement in Bloody Sunday, and then the 4 lads to the right there, Frank Flood, Patrick Doyle, Brian Ryan, Thomas Bryan, they were executed for their part in the Drumcondra ambush in January 1921. Now, what the British had started to do was to execute the IRA. They started it with Kevin Barry in November. They ramped up the executions in 1921. And in this case, it was 6 men together. They were hanged in pairs at intervals of half an hour or so. The IRA were told to get revenge, and they were not going to let this slide. And in Pearse Street, you have Padre O'Mara. He was one of the officers, and with about 34 men, they go on the attack, and it leads to what's called the Great Brunswick Street ambush, or the Battle of Great Brunswick Street. So here you see some newspaper reports and a great photograph taken in the aftermath of what happened. But what did happen is that the auxiliaries were attacked by the IRA. They were set up basically. So you had volunteer Sean Dolan, and he sort of kicks off things, because he threw a grenade at the police station in Pearse Street, but the grenade bounced back and hit him and exploded, and he ended up losing his leg. Now, he was taken to Mercer Hospital, thankfully by the members of the fire brigade, who were either citizen army or members of the IRA. So they had a cover story for him. But word was sent to the Dublin Castle that something was going on. The police station was being attacked. So they barreled down from Dublin Castle, and this is F Company, the notorious F Company. But they didn't stop at Brunswick Street Station. They actually made straight for 144. They had been told, word had gotten to them that there were fellas at 144, so they did have an informer, and the IRA knew that someone was giving them information. So they go flying down Great Brunswick Street, Pearse Street, and you can see it here. This is pretty much the streetscape there, and just before they get to where 144 is, they come under attack from the other members of the IRA Tour Battalion. The battle lasted a few minutes. And the thing was that when this happened, curfew had been introduced in Dublin, so you had to be off the streets by 9 o'clock, otherwise you were in trouble. In the patrol, you had an armoured car and 2 tenders, so approximately maybe 22 Crown Forces, and as I said, around 35 volunteers. But as I said, it was over in minutes. What you do have, sorry, I just have to move this, in that time you had 2 auxiliaries were killed, so section leader Joseph Beard and temporary cadet Francis Farrell. 2 IRA were killed, Leo Fitzgerald, who was at the beginning of our story, who joined the Fianna way back in 1909. He had now become a member of the IRA, and Bernard O'Hanlon. 4 civilians were also killed, Thomas Asquith, David Kelly, Stephen Clark and Mary Frances Morgan, and 6 people were wounded. 2 IRA were also captured, Thomas Traynor and John Donnelly, both members of B Company, as was Leo Fitzgerald. Now, both Traynor and Donnelly were sentenced to death for their part in the events that took place at 144. And Thomas Traynor was executed on the 25th of April 1921. John Donnelly had been wounded, and by the time he was put on trial, the sort of peace feelers were being put out, although he was awaiting his death sentence with Sean McKeown, who was also had been put on trial, and they were not executed because the truce was or had come into effect. Now, what you then have after that, so despite the fact that you have these losses, again, it looks like the British are winning, they are gaining the upper hand, because again, at the start of 1921, the IRA had suffered big losses, but they hit back, and they always hit back. You have in April, and Joe has mentioned it earlier on, you have the attack at the LNWR Hotel, and then the big one, of course, is the Custom House on the 25th of May 1921. But I just want to show you here just some of the attacks or events that the B, D and K Company of the Tour Battalion were involved in. And there you have, look, 29th of April, the ambush, another ambush in Great Brunswick Street, 25th of May, Custom House, 7th of June, Westland Row ambush, Pearse Street ambush, followed by ambushes all over the city. D Company on 24th of April, King's Inn, that's 1920, sorry, the raid for arms. 1921, 22nd of March, you've got an ambush at Grand Canal Bridge on Clarence Street, again involving the Custom House. Tans bombed at Ringsend, 2 men wounded in Sandymount ambush, big ambush in Ringsend. And then we've got K Company, their armoured car attacked in Merrion Square on the 31st of March. Again, Custom House, they're all involved in the Custom House, that major operation. 19th of May, or 18th of May, military car shot in Clare Street. 9th of June, military lorries bombed in Mount Street. So you can see that within those 3 companies alone, they were continuing their activities against the Crown Forces, not letting anything stop. And then we have the arrival in March of Q Company Auxiliaries, and they are based in the LNWR Hotel. And if you haven't seen that amazing film that was done by the Eastwall History Group, you have to see it. It's brilliant. But they were sent there, and their role, their primary role, their only role was to stop and search, to stop the arms smuggling, to stop suspected persons leaving the country, and so on. And there you see the members of Q Company. But to counter that, you then have the formation of Q Company of the Tour Battalion. And I have to say a huge thank you to Jerry Shannon for this, because it was his great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather, John Archie Kennedy, who was OC of Q Company, and he worked in that area. Now, he was a member of B Company, and he was specifically given the task to take command, choose 50 men to be his unit in Q Company, and their role was to ensure that no guns were lost, to continue that smuggling of arms and so on. And you can see here from Archie's own pension file the type of activities that they were involved in, and he says there, about this time, and this is April 1921, I was called to HQ, Old IRA, to organise men in ships and about the keys for gun running. This I did to the great satisfaction of General Michael Collins, late Chief of Staff Sean McMahon. So you can see there all of these connections. I think it was April 1921. I personally recruited and initiated over 50 men, which was called Q Company, and was made captain. And then when he became OC at Q Company, he performed his duty in an excellent manner. During this period he was in charge, we did not lose a single article in the case. So you can see how important it was to have a separate company set up primarily to deal with the guns and the smuggling and the activities down the quays, because the quays were so important to the IRA and their cause. Now, just to end, people talk about the Custom House, and it's this is the last big engagement, and whether people see it as a disaster, people like me see it as a success, but the IRA continued to be very active after the Custom House, despite the fact that over 100 were arrested, but there were more than 100 fellas in the IRA. There were close to 300 men took part in the operation, so you have pretty much 200 men that were involved in that day, still free, as well as all of the other people, members of the IRA. And Joseph O'Connor was very, very adamant, OC of the Tour Battalion, that the Tour Battalion was not affected by the events on the 25th of May. They were good to go and continued to be very active. But you probably saw in the previous slide there with A or with B, D and K Company, their activities. They all mentioned this event on the 10th of July 1921, general operation in Dublin against all British. And this is going to be bigger than the Custom House. And look at the date. The date is key. This was a day before the truce. And this was the shoot 'em up. And what basically was planned, again, curfew had been introduced. No one but the military were to be on the streets after a certain time. But in O'Connell Street, you had the military basically in control, but swanning up and down O'Connell Street with their girlfriends. The IRA had planned to basically come from all corners of O'Connell Street. So from Parnell Street, Henry Street, South North Earl Street, and then Bachelor's Walk and Eden Quay. And they were going to cut it off. And they were going to shoot everything that was in O'Connell Street. Auxiliary, British soldier, woman, it didn't matter, because if you were there, you were part of the military or connected to the military. And they were also going to shoot a number of auxiliaries and hotels around the city. The operation was called off, and there's great descriptions in the witness statements of one of the volunteers, and he is cycling along because word had come through that the truce was coming into effect the next day, and they called it off last minute. And you can just imagine all of these volunteers just descending from every street, side street off O'Connell Street. The operation was called off, but they did actually shoot some auxiliaries on the south side of the city. But what this shows you is that the Tour Battalion was active right up until the very end. And what I hope this talk has shown is that the War of Independence in Dublin, it wasn't carried out by the activities of just one battalion or a certain section. You needed everyone to play their part, and the Tour Battalion certainly did. And I would just like to say a huge thank you to the Dublin Port Company, the East Wall History Group, Military Archives, Joe Mooney, Jared Donnelly for that photograph of his grandfather, Jerry Shannon, Cathy Scuffle, and me, Hall of Dublin, and of course yourselves. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
You can't see me, Liz, but I always give a round of applause. That was a fascinating way of sharing that story. Thank you. I was captivated. Um, we're gonna open it up for Q&A now. So please feel free to fill in the chat box there with any interesting questions you want to throw to Liz.
Hey, Colin.
I guess to get us started here, Liz, I didn't know so much about the different areas of the community, and how they all acted together and, kind of who was against where and how that was determined by where you lived. I guess what I'd ask is like if it's still like that today.
As in, well, I suppose like if you look at in terms of how organizations would be set up.
In terms of like how organizations were like the 3rd Battalion and just how organizations were set around in different communities, in different parts of the city. And you wouldn't want to go into that area or, that area was known for this. And there's a lot of politics. Does that still exist today or?
Well, I suppose you have the north side, south side divide, and I'm a south sider, so yeah, but that's just the way we are. No, see, back then, it was easiest. It was the easiest thing to do was to make base companies on your localities, and because it made sense with in terms of the guys you knew, so that trust was there. And it would be very hard, for an outsider to come in to infiltrate, because that was the one thing that always sort of dogged the Republican movement beforehand, was that it was so easy for informers to, get involved or infiltrate the movement. But if you have guys that have grown up together, like in the case of the Fianna, so some of the earliest members were students from St Andrew's School, so they would have probably started school together, played together, they'd know their secrets, and you have that real close-knit group, which really doesn't after the split in 1914, Redmond split, where the volunteers actually split with the First World War. What is left in the Irish Volunteers is a really, really tight-knit nucleus of men who are thinking along the same lines. It's the same with the women. So I suppose it's like community groups today. They're living in that community. So why would you get outsiders to create a group relating to your community when you live in there and knows what's best for your community? It's sort of the same thing.
Absolutely. No, that's great. We got another question in the chat box here from Lar. Says, hi Liz, great talk. In relation to Mount Saint, how many of 17 volunteers later fought in the War of Independence?
The majority of them. So you have Michael Malone is killed, George Reynolds was killed, Patrick Doyle was killed, Richard Carroll was killed. I think it was 4 of them were killed, and then all the others, as far as I know, now I could be wrong, but I think all of the others do go on. Joe Clark, definitely, he was fighting until his dying day. He was still getting hauled off planes and stuff. But you have not Simon Donnelly. There's the 2 brothers, the Walsh brothers. They were involved. They were in Clan William House. Joe Clark. I said Joe Clark. Yeah, there's the majority of them. The majority of them, if I'm not mistaken, continued to be involved. And certainly Seamus Grace, who was with Michael Malone, number 25, he continues to be involved. So some of them are very, very active in the War of Independence and Civil War as well.
Lovely, thank you. Just another question here, general question before we end off here. Do you have a favorite story within the War of Independence that you're really hooked on, one that you could talk about forever, or a favorite person to study?
Oh God.
It'd be hard to choose. You have a great memory of the names, the faces, and their lives. So I'm just wondering if there's one person that always kind of sticks out for you, or if there's one story that you love talking about.
Okay, I'll just two people, right? And one's a man, one's a woman, and they're basically the one person, and it's Tom and Kathleen Clark. So Tom Clark to me is just the whole mind of the revolution. And when you look what that man went through, he dedicated his whole life to the cause of Irish freedom. And Kathleen Daly married Tom Clark, and their book, if you haven't read her book, Revolutionary Woman, I think it is, My Fight for Irish Freedom, read it. It is fabulous, because everyone thinks the love story 1916 is Joseph and Grace Gifford, and it is, but there's an even better love story in my mind, and that's Tom and Kathleen, because they you know, she had him bigged up in her mind when he was in prison with her uncle John Daly for his part in the Fenian Dynamite campaign. And when her uncle was released, he was talking about Tom Clark, and she had this image of this big heroic man, and when she met him, he was like this really frail old man, and sort of, it didn't put her off, but you know, our sort of bubble was burst. But she still fell in love with him, and then they got married in New York and they had kids, but he was always watching what was happening in Ireland. And around 1907, he hears of Sean McDermott and Bulmer Hobson and the reorganisation of the IRB, and he wants to come back to Ireland. And she knows that if she goes back to Ireland, they will not live out their life together as an old couple, and they don't. And he loved her, but he loved Ireland even more. And just Tom Clark is just, he's my favourite. I'm sorry, I love him. I do. I love him. Kathleen is just formidable. Anything to do with the Tour Battalion as well, because my great uncle was a member of 8 Company Tour Battalion. So Tour Battalion.
Wow, I'm learning all kinds of things about you tonight, Liz. Last question, and then we'll let everybody go. Last question here from Joe Mooney, our very own. How did the volunteers of the 3rd Battalion align after the treaty?
Majority anti. See, it's Dev Zone. E Company was called Dev Zone, and I don't know if that's probably why the 3rd Battalion maybe gets a little bit sidelined, because it was Dev's battalion and the Civil War politics coming into it. But then you had Sean McMahon, who was pro-treaty, and he was a big name. But the majority of the Dublin battalions go anti-treaty, with the exception of the 2nd. And that was because Tom Ennis, he goes pro-treaty. Tom Ennis is like total Collins man, and the majority of the 2nd Battalion go anti. And a lot of it depends on what way your commanding officer went. But I have found very few 3rd Battalion men go pro. It's the same with the 4th Battalion. My area, only a handful of them go pro-treaty. You've got the majority anti-treaty, real Republican area in the Civil War.